It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio, of course, is in your future. In this segment, I'm very pleased to have with us Scott McGaugh. He is the best-selling author of Surgeon in Blue. He is also the marketing director for the USS Midway Museum. He lives in glorious San Diego, California. A prolific author, a fascinating new work called Honor Before Glory, the epic World War II story of the Japanese-American GIs who rescued the Lost Battalion. A fascinating story indeed. Excited to get into it. Scott, how are you, my friend?
I am doing very well. It's a pleasure being with you today.
I guess our first question here, an important one, is if you were born and raised in San Diego and you live there now, where in the world do you go for vacation?
That's a good question. A lot of times we don't need to go very far. We remind ourselves all the time aboard Midway and throughout San Diego that folks work all year long in order to spend a week or two right here in what we call our own backyard. I am more than fortunate to call San Diego my home.
Well, let's dive right into this. We all know, or many of us do, I think, if you're a historian at all, that right after Pearl Harbor, with the Second World War, over 100,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated along the west coast of these United States. But this story is about some of those Japanese Americans. And give us a little setup here in Honor Before Glory. Give us the basic premise, and then we'll dive into it.
Well, you gave us a good running start. 110,000 Japanese Americans were interned within 6 months of Pearl Harbor. About a year later, President Roosevelt decided to create the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, an all-Japanese American unit commanded only by Caucasian officers in a segregated army at a time when the outcome of the war was very much in doubt and more soldiers were needed to fill out the ranks of what became the greatest generation. The 442nd became very famous. Remarkably, more than 1,000 of the young men, 18, 19, 20 years of age, volunteered from behind the barbed wire of those internment camps that you mentioned. Thousands and thousands more volunteered from Hawaii who were not interned, but really became the foundation of what became the 442nd. And it became then a remarkable unit. It was frequently assigned the most dangerous missions in the war, leading up to a fateful rescue mission that you mentioned that took place late in 1944 in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France.
What was it about this particular story? I know there's obviously thousands of things to write about, particularly regarding World War II. How did you find this one? What caught your eye here?
Well, it really came from an earlier book. Actually, it came from the flight deck of the USS Midway when I first learned of some of the amazing, anonymously heroic feats that individual sailors had performed aboard Midway in its 47 years of service. It really took me down a road, Warner, that I didn't expect. It led to a couple books about Midway, and from there I began discovering other anonymous, heroic young Americans in World War II. You know, so much of our legacy of service to country in uniform is built on the backs of individuals. And it just became so inspiring, and one book has led to another, including Surgeon in Blue, another one about military medicine. And it was there that I discovered Jim Akubo, a medic in the 442nd, and what he ultimately did in earning a Medal of Honor during this rescue mission. And while some books have been written about that mission and the 442nd, I had the privilege of being given access to about 100 oral histories that almost had never been seen before, recorded by these Japanese Americans just in the last 5 or 6 years, almost in a way on their deathbed, if you will, in their late 80s and 90s, finally sharing what they endured and what they accomplished. And that became really the driving force behind Honor Before Glory.
You know, this unique chapter in American history at the beginning of the war with these interned Japanese Americans, and yet they volunteer to fight for the very country that's incarcerated them. What explain the mindset, if you would. Go inside their mind and share with us a little bit what was the motivation, and they must have had a lot of mixed feelings.
They certainly did. Reading these oral histories and their correspondence that the Go for Broke National Education Center in L.A. Made available was really as inspiring and amazing here in the U.S. before they ever got to the battlefield as what they did on the battlefield. To answer your question directly, many of them felt an obligation to prove to the rest of America, you and me, frankly, that they were worthy of being Japanese American citizens, and they didn't deserve to be interned just because of their ethnicity. In the Japanese culture, there's a great driving value of bringing pride to their family, representing their family. I remember reading one mother telling her son in an internment camp in California, "Die if you must for your country, but do not bring dishonor to your family." I just can't imagine a mother telling her 20-year-old son that as he was headed off to a processing center and ultimately Europe or even the Pacific. So it was really a mixed bag, if you will, in terms of dedication to their country, no matter how they had been treated, dedication to their family, and that really, I think, became their inspiration to ultimately the 442nd becoming the most decorated unit of its size in the entire war. 18,000 men earned more than 18,000 individual awards for bravery. Just a remarkable part of the mosaic that we now call the Greatest Generation.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck, of course, of Lewis at Large Radio, and got a good one going here talking to Scott McGaugh. He is a best-selling author, historian, author of Surgeon in Blue. He's also the marketing director, as he mentioned a little earlier, of the USS Midway Museum in San Diego. Brand new work called Honor Before Glory, a unique story of Japanese American GIs and their volunteer heroic work. Well, Scott, if you would, let's talk specifically about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and talk to us about the mission that they had.
Well, it took place in October of 1944. The Germans were being pushed back toward the border of their own country, the Rhine. Normandy had taken place. Operation Dragoon had taken place, the invasion of southern France. They had reached the Vosges Mountains at the edge of winter, and the Germans knew the Americans were coming. The Germans had been in those mountains for years. They were thoroughly dug in, and simplistically, the Germans allowed a battalion to get too far out in front of the American front lines. 141st 1st Battalion, 275 men advanced along a single logging road on a mountain ridge about 6 miles in front of the other American troops. Germans closed in behind them and simply trapped them. These American soldiers carried 1 day's worth of medical supplies, food, and water. Within a matter of days, they had suffered dozens and dozens of casualties. Other Caucasian units had been ordered to relieve them, reach them. They failed, and ultimately General Dahlquist turned to the 442nd that had just come off the line just 2 days earlier, had suffered hundreds of casualties, and yet he ordered them to advance straight up that logging road where the enemy was waiting and reach the lost battalion. It took a week. It took hundreds more casualties, and some of the most remarkable feats of individual heroism and bravery and sacrifice took place along that logging road.
Can you hear? Whoa. Had a little technical difficulty there. Hey, I want to make sure, and again, we count on people like you to tell these kinds of stories. To my knowledge, has this story been brought forward anywhere else other than the research you've done?
It has to some extent. Some books were written, articles certainly. Those who are devoted military history fans in World War II are familiar with it. But what really has come to light in the last 5 years or so is many of these veterans now sharing their stories, sharing their feelings more than anything else. 60, 70 years later in oral histories. There's been a big movement in this country, and a good one, in the last 10 years to collect more oral histories, especially of the Greatest Generation, as we lose them so quickly. So really this book shines a light more personally, if you will, from the inside out, from the hearts and minds of these Japanese Americans, much more so than other books have, simply because these men now are beginning to share in their last days on Earth what they went through, and just in some cases, how deep and tender the scars still are 70 years later.
What was the military? I mean, again, we had the Japanese battalions, but overall, sort of philosophically, how did the United States military look on the Japanese Americans as soldiers, and were they distrustful? Were they treated differently? Tell us about that.
They were treated very differently at the outset. Again, a segregated unit sent down to Mississippi. Imagine the dynamics of Caucasian officers training Japanese Americans in Mississippi. The local residents in Mississippi didn't know whether to treat Japanese Americans as white soldiers or African American soldiers. There were all kinds of issues from that perspective. There were different cultural values between the Hawaiian-born Japanese Americans and the American-born or mainland Japanese Americans. All that had to be overcome before they were finally sent overseas. Literally, Warner, within days of their first battle, there were headlines back home in the U.S. about the amazing heroism and courage and ability to overcome incredible odds by these young men. Within months, there were generals, Mark Clark and others in Italy, saying, if you've got more Japanese American soldiers in the U.S. in training, send them over. I can use all that you've got. They impressed senior commanding officers almost from the day they stepped onto the battlefield.
What about, or I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, but just to kind of follow up here, when the war was over, did anybody account for where these people went? Did they stay? Did they return to, quote, normal citizenship, so to speak, or what happened to most of them?
That's a great question, and that was a big part of my research. It really grew much more than I anticipated when I first started on this book. This book became much more than a week-long rescue mission, as remarkable as it was. To answer your question, some of them came home quietly, anonymously, and rebuilt their lives as mechanics and restaurant owners and bakers and farmers and so on. Many of them came home to anti-Japanese discrimination. There were some campaigns in some small communities where Caucasian homeowners and property owners banded together and refused to sell the farms back to the Japanese Americans who had lost them 2 or 3 years earlier when they were interned. There was vandalism in some cases. A famous instance in Oregon where an American Legion post had a monument to all the local boys who served in World War II, except for the Japanese Americans from that community. Their names were not included. And yet, in other contexts, they came home as heroes. President Truman, time and time again, singled them out as some of the greatest examples of what it took to win World War II. Virtually every commanding officer, from the frontline men all the way up to Army commanders, praised the legacy and the service of Japanese Americans. So it took a while, unfortunately, in our country, in terms of our relationship with different ethnicities. This was, again, in the late 40s and 50s, so think about the context at that time. It took a while for them to come back home and resume their lives. Many of them, during this mission, earned Medals of Honor nominations. They were downgraded for no reason, stated, to lesser honors awards. And it took literally 60 years before 21 Japanese Americans in the year 2000 were awarded the Medals of Honor that they had earned literally 6 decades earlier.
So we have hundreds of U.S. troops that are surrounded by German troops in eastern France. Fierce fighting goes on, and they are rescued. And they look into the eyes of the soldiers rescuing them, and they see Japanese Americans. What are those that were rescued? What were they thinking when they saw who their rescuers were?
There are many reports. I had the opportunity to interview several of the men who were rescued around the country. A couple of them thought, honestly, that the Japanese had joined the Germans, and that they didn't realize that there were Japanese American soldiers coming to rescue them, because they were stranded. Most of the men who were rescued were simply in shock. They had lived a horrific 6-7 days under enemy fire, surrounded at the edge of starvation, dehydration, dying for a cigarette in some cases. Many times, and I've seen this in other instances, it was simply a handshake, a simple thanks, and that was about all that was said. The Lost Battalion then was trucked off the ridge. The 442nd did not come off the ridge after the week-long rescue. It continued on to the original objective of this Lost Battalion, stayed on the ridge in combat for another week or so before they were finally relieved. So it was, I think, a muted rescue scene, if you will. It must have been extraordinary seeing these hundreds of American Caucasian soldiers climbing out from their foxholes, filthy, emaciated, towering over these Japanese Americans and trying to find the words to thank them for saving their lives.
When you did this research, you spent several days over there in eastern France. I'm fascinated. As you walked along that former battlefield in that area, you found quite a few objects you believe directly from those battles, did you not?
You know, you just asking the question gives me chills a year later after spending, like you say, several days on that ridge. I was not prepared for the intimacy of the battlefield. I'd done the research, and I'd interviewed some men, and I oral histories, and I knew they advanced a few trees at a time. A day's progress was measured in lengths of a football field. But to see American foxholes 20, 30, 40, 50 feet from German foxholes facing each other, to sit in those foxholes and look down and see pieces of shrapnel and machine gun cartridges. In one foxhole I looked down, there was an American machine gun cartridge, and right next to it was a German machine gun cartridge. How could that have happened? What must have taken place in that foxhole between Germans and Japanese Americans, again, 20, 21 years of age? There's still shrapnel lodged in trees. Dugout areas, indentations that were filled with mud and water that were aid stations during the rescue mission. The intimacy, again, of the battlefield and knowing that these young men faced Germans who had been dug in for weeks and weeks and weeks and knew the exact route of the rescuers along this single logging road. It just, to this day, gives me chills to think about what they endured in order to reach the Lost Battalion.
Again, you've just joined us, Warner Lewis here, Flight Deck of Lewis at Large Radio, as we are every week. We're talking to Scott McGaugh, well-known author and historian. He's also the marketing director for out in San Diego and living the good life out there. He's the marketing director for the USS Midway Museum. If you have not been there, you should go. It's great in and of itself. Well, Scott, okay, so I'm curious as to, you saw some of the remnants of the battle. Do historians besides yourself walk through that area, or is it so wooded over it's really hard to find?
Well, a little bit of both. Again, a great question. It's part of it's now the equivalent of a national forest or a state forest in France, managed by local municipalities for some lumbering, not a great deal. So it's largely untouched. But I'll share with you, in the nearby French towns that were liberated by the Japanese Americans, the 442nd, on their way to this rescue mission, a few weeks later, the 442nd is still held in this century in extraordinarily high regard. They have annual celebrations and remembrances of the sacrifices of the 442nd soldiers every October, celebrating the liberation of that part of France by the Americans, and principally the Japanese Americans. So the trail is well known. It's not marked. There are a few small memorials, stone memorials, at the site of where the Lost Battalion was reached, put together by both local French residents and the family members of many of the 442nd Japanese soldiers. There are still almost annual pilgrimages along that logging road by some of the Japanese American men now in their 80s and 90s with their grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. It is a place of reverence. It is a place of sadness. It is a place of tears, for both Americans and the French.
So we kind of start to wind down here, Scott, a little bit. This whole story, which is a military story, but on a much broader context, it's also a sort of a social commentary. What's maybe surprised you the most as you research this story? What jumped out at you as something we really need to hang on to?
I think this is a story of the best and perhaps the worst of the American spirit. It wasn't the first time, and certainly if you look at today's national conversations, it wasn't the last time that there was fear and vengeance brushed across an ethnic group, rightly or wrongly, at that point in our nation's history. The way we treated, with 20/20 hindsight, the Japanese Americans, you can debate that for a long time, and yet to see how they, again, as American citizens themselves, rose above that to serve their country, to volunteer or be willingly drafted to die for their country while their families remain behind barbed wire, is just extraordinary. So for me, the takeaway of the book wasn't the battlefield tactics, although it was amazing what they did reaching them, but just the greatest generation in a very personal way. And where I'll share with you, here aboard the USS Midway, we have veterans, World War II veterans, who share their stories with our guests and so on. And many of them have said to me, many times, they almost take offense now at being called the greatest generation. They've looked me in the eye, and these guys are 90, 91 years of age, and they've said, I was just there at that point in life, in time, in our nation's history, and I responded to what my nation needed. And they'll continue to go on to say, and that's what young men and women are doing today. They did it during Vietnam, agree or not, Korea, agree or not, serving their country. I'm just part, they will say, of the greatest generation of all Americans who always respond in times of need or crisis to their country. And they provide a context that I think is broader than just World War II, broader than just the 442nd, but it really reflects who we are as a people. And I think for me, that was the biggest takeaway and the biggest source of inspiration and optimism for what the future holds for America.
Well, again, the work is called Honor Before Glory, the epic World War II story of the Japanese-American GIs who rescued the Lost Battalion. Fascinating military story, fascinating story about our culture and the ability to respond to adversity. Scott, how can people find out a little bit more about some of the other work that you do and maybe pick up a copy of the book?
It's available in bookstores and certainly online at Barnes & Noble and Amazon and places like that. My website is the spelling of my name, Scott, S-C-O-T-T, McGaugh, M-C-G-A-U-G-H.com. Information about Midway. The museum is at midway.org. Those are always a couple of great places to go to learn a little bit more about what the special place is here in San Diego.
So what's your next project?
Well, my family has me on suicide watch. This is my 7th book in 14 years, and for the first time in about 16 years, I don't have the next book locked in. A couple of concepts my agent and I are kicking around, but I'm a little bit at loose ends until I have one that I've drawn a bead on that I'll be working on, but I'm sure it's going to be something along these lines. There are so many more great stories that don't just need to be told, but their legacies need to be preserved. That's what we do aboard Midway here. Every day is Veterans Day aboard Midway. And what I can do, to whatever extent I can as an author, to support that's what I'm here for.
Well, appreciate you sharing time with us today. It's a fascinating book, a fascinating story, and best of luck to you. Love to have you back on again sometime.
Thank you, Warner. I look forward to it. Take care.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.